Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The Department of Justice report on MPD, the city's response, and much more tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes with the Daily Memphian. Thanks for joining us. I am joined by a roundtable of journalists this week to talk about some of the biggest stories of the week. It includes Laura Testino from the Daily Memphian. Thanks for being here again.
Yeah, thanks.
Toby Sells from the Memphis Flyer. Thanks for being here, Toby.
Thanks for having me.
And Bill Dries from the Daily Memphian. Obviously the biggest story is the DOJ report. We're recording this Thursday morning, and so it came out, I think, Wednesday, the city's response. I think even as we're taping this, there's a news conference from the Department of Justice, and the city's going to respond to that. So we don't have everything, but we know a lot, and maybe I'll start, Bill, and I'll kind of summarize some things, and you fill in with what I've missed in what's a 75-page report from the U.S. Department of Justice that was triggered after the killing of Tyre Nichols by MPD officers. It's a pattern or practice investigation that happens in cities around the country. DOJ has done this before, and there's actually has done it, I believe, here, and you'll correct me on that. What that report found, beyond a series of really, really awful incidents that we'll talk about some, and some of which we've reported on and others have reported on, some have not. MPD discriminates against black residents and those with behavioral health issues. It accuses MPD of violating civil rights, of using excessive force, of conducting unlawful stops, searches, and arrests, of unlawfully discriminating against black people when enforcing the law, and that the city and MPD unlawfully discriminate, as I said, in their response to people with behavioral health disabilities. This is not, Bill, just to be clear, about the Tyre Nichols case. This is many, many incidents they point to and data they point to over a multi-year period. It was a 17-month investigation. What did I miss?
Well, this started in July of 2023. Most of the time, these kind of reports take years. This one had a shorter time schedule, and we'll get into that a bit further into the discussion here. But for me, in reading the report, what struck me is the gap between how officers are trained and then what officers do on the street. That's the primary overarching issue that I think this report outlines.
Yeah. Laura, your thoughts? I mean, you were reporting on it in part. One of the folks for us reporting on it yesterday. Just thoughts and things that stood out for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to build upon your point, Bill, there's officials talk about this. It's talked about in the report. Just what this does to even delegitimize the efforts of the police department to solve crime and be effective at their jobs, as many people in Memphis want them to be. One example of that is, the way that the police department does the saturation policing that it did with the Scorpion unit that was involved in the beating of Tyre Nichols. That sort of policing being more generalized to a neighborhood rather than specific to particular people or even particular streets rather than an entire neighborhood is when we see a lot of these interactions that are outlined in the report where excessive force is used, where what the DOJ says is often unlawful search and seizure is used. And then just one other kind of point that was of particular interest to me on the education beat is that this report points out that police also escalate with children. These
children
are not
as young as 8, not just
children as young as 8.
Children,
yes,
there are examples of children with 8 being handcuffed,
yes,
etc. Go ahead.
So children as young as 8, teens. There are examples of using pepper spray on teenagers, and other examples, and spell out that this escalation can happen when children are not even found to be engaged in criminal activity, often found when they were victims of crime. And then you see the indirect exposure of all of this for children who are watching this excessive force happen to friends and family members in their community.
There's an example of a young woman who had actually called the police to, I say young woman, I think she's 16, 15 if I remember correctly, who had called the police to report an assault on her and ends up handcuffed, ends up being roughed up, ends up being, really charged, and then is then charged because she's fighting because she wouldn't hand over her phone, and, just a really awful sort of incident that's described. Things for you, Toby, that stood out?
One of the top line things, of course, is the disparities between use of force, other things, just enforcement in general, between the white population and the black population. It's all in the report, but I was doing some research around this and found a great 2021 story from WREG, and a story that took them more than a year to report because they couldn't get the information from the city government. But that report found that excessive force was used against black men in Memphis 7 times more than white men in Memphis, and they had all the facts and figures. It's a great story. Go look it up. So we've known this is a problem for a really, really long time, and it's one of those cynical opinions out there that we have in Memphis, that we know that police treat black people different than white people, but it's really based on cynical fact. You start digging into some of this stuff. I was looking at some MPD data for a story for next week that showed that even traffic tickets, 75% of them are for African Americans, and in the proportions just don't work out. We are a majority minority city here. We're proud of that, but these proportions on almost any criminal activity, cannabis possession, it is way disproportionate, blown out of the water.
Yeah, and I believe a majority black force of MPD.
That's right.
I mean, obviously, in the case of Tyre Nichols, as we all know, that the main people accused there were all black. Let me take a quick second before I go back to Bill and say that Mayor Paul Young said in a statement based on this report, "Make no mistake, we take the DOJ's findings seriously and we'll review the lengthy report with an open mind. I believe it is critical we take the necessary time to thoroughly review in order to formulate a response. Our dedication to improving MPD is unwavering, and we believe that working with local stakeholders and national experts will yield a plan that effectively meets our community's needs versus a government consent decree." And we're going to come to you, Bill, and talk about what a consent decree is and the complication of that. Let me also, though, quote from C.J. Davis, the interim police chief: "We believe in continuous improvement and do not take this process lightly. We believe in improved policing and training and the progress we are seeing daily. We will continue to improve. We will continue to work with national police reform experts and the DOJ to produce a plan that can be implemented effectively and efficiently." But again, she points out, she makes the case, without federal constraint and undue financial burden to the residents of Memphis. Both Mayor Young and C.J. Davis and others are very concerned about and pushing back against the idea of a consent decree. Talk about that and the history of that and so on.
A consent decree can be a memorandum of understanding between the Justice Department and the city, or it could be something that goes into court. If it goes into court, what that means is a judge oversees it, monitors to make sure the city is complying with it, are then employed, in most cases paid for by the city.
Yeah, and there's an example of in Baltimore, which is under a consent decree, that they've spent millions of dollars on because of the consent decree that was put on them for some actions.
Right, and that seems to be what the problem is for this city administration.
Yeah.
We should point out, like I said, usually these studies take 2 to 3 years. This one came to a head because of what happened on November 5th, who was elected president.
Yeah.
Donald Trump, 10 months into his first term, wiped away a study that the DOJ was doing like this into the MPD.
Yeah, and let me go to this. Obviously, that is what hangs over all this. A huge change in the DOJ from the top on down, and a general belief that, I mean, it sounds cynical, but I am sure that there's a general belief for MPD in the city and for other cities facing this, that if we just run out the clock, Trump is not likely to enforce this the way that the Biden administration or a future Democratic administration would have.
Absolutely. I think, you don't need a crystal ball to see that. Trump has always run as a law and order president. He's promised that again in this one. He's also, when it comes to police force, he's said in rallies and things that, when he watches police rough up protesters, he says it was a beautiful thing to watch. substantively, he's said that he is immediately going to roll back a 2022 executive order from the Biden administration that it did a lot of things, but mainly it limited the amount of force that federal cops can use, and also said that if you're a cop and you see another one engaged in this kind of enforcement, that you got to step in. That executive order also limited the amount of military gear that the federal government can either transfer or sell to state and local governments, and all that's going to be wiped out again too. So again, you don't need a crystal ball to see that the Biden administration is going to be very different than the Trump administration on this question.
Go ahead, Laura.
I was just going to say, and without the consent decree, it becomes very unclear what natural steps forward we have to implement some of the remedies that are found in this report. And some of the problems found in this report is that MPD does a bad job at supervising itself, right? There's a lot of instances here where it said, well, we watched a video, and what happened in the video is not what the officers said happened in this report. And so, without the consent decree, I think people are going to be left wondering, is this just going to be another report that shows all of these problems that maybe we had an inkling existed, and we have no path forward for a solution?
Bill.
Just to talk about the past, the previous investigation took place in the last year of the Obama administration.
Yeah.
And it was still underway when all of a sudden Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, basically said, no, we're not doing that anymore.
Yeah.
What we're going to do is we're going to better equip police departments with hardware, with support, things like that. None of the issues in this report are new.
Yeah.
Right.
There are. People should read the report and the reporting on the report. But the report itself, 77 pages, an executive summary, and there's these incidents and there's descriptions. And we've covered at the Daily Memphian, at this table, as crime really took off through the pandemic and has begun to kind of tick down, we've spent a lot of time talking to lots of different people in the criminal justice system, pretty much everyone who would sit down with me and Bill and talk to us, which isn't everybody, but it's been a lot of them. And, no one, and when Tyre Nichols came out, and we did some surveying and we did some community conversations, kind of focus groups, and it was very clear that overwhelmingly people want more better policing. They don't want police officers who beat people up. I think Toby said this at the top. People want that. And when we did, Bill, 8 city mayor the top candidates for mayor, former Harrington, Mayor Young, who won, Van Turner always stands out to me. And I tell this to people from outside Memphis, that every single candidate we talk to, correct me if I'm wrong, wants more police. And that includes Van Turner, who is the former head of the NAACP. And when I say that to people in other cities, they kind of look at me like, what? Wait. No, he was talking about 500 more police officers, going from 2,000 to 500. And it's really interesting and difficult to reconcile, I think, some of the dissonance you're talking about, Laura, of they're not doing what they're trained to do, they're not doing what the video shows, yet there's a city that by and large overwhelmingly wants more better police. And that is black and white, and again, black people in this city are overwhelmingly the victims of crime. Right. But they want good policing. They want smart policing, and they don't want people to be roughed up. And it's kind of hard to reconcile all that in some form or fashion.
Just to tag on that, I was thinking, I am not an expert in this situation. There are very smart people, and I'm glad there are in this city that are thinking about this, working on this every day. So I'm a tourist here, but I do think there are some simple things that we can do. Should we stop pepper spraying people that are handcuffed in the back of a cop car? I think we can do that. Can we stop slapping cuffs on kids that have asked for help? I think we can do that too. Can we stop threatening kids with mental disabilities with prison and the taser if they ran away from home? I think there's some simple, easy things that we can do here. As for the rest of it, super complicated. Now I'll get out of my Monday morning quarterback uniform here, but boy, you see these things in there and you think, how on earth is this Memphis, Tennessee?
There are a couple more things I'm going to highlight, and I know there are people listening who are frustrated and who because they want crime to come down, because they and their families and their loved ones and their neighbors to not be impacted by crime, and that this is very, very difficult, and to just come down on the police is not going to help.
Right.
And is not going to help reduce crime. There are a couple things in the report that are these are small things that they're almost incidental, but it's interesting when you get these reports and there's a certain tone deafness. And two things stood out. One was highlighting the number of times, the number of citations for incidental things with cars like, expired tags and tinted windows. And I hear from people all the time, and maybe y'all do too, who are, why in the world are there so many expired tags in Memphis? And why are tinted windows that are tinted to a certain point just allowed? These things shouldn't be allowed. Like, if you say that you're not going to enforce the law around all these expired tags, you have no credibility. That's right. And there's the report, as I read it, doesn't really get into that dynamic. It gets into the old broken windows theory that the chief of police in New York, and I think he'd been in Boston too, came in and said, look, if you're looking past the broken windows, or you're looking past people who jump over the turnstile into the subway, you're allowing a lawlessness. And you have to crack down on the small stuff in order to create a sense that, not with pepper spray, not with abuse, I want to be really clear with that, but that you have to sort of enforce the laws. And I think there are people who will read this report and get frustrated about some of those things, the way in which the DOJ report kind of dismisses the citations for low-level offenses. The other disconnect that stood out to me for some reason, well, I know why it stood out to me, which was this thing, there's a little anecdote about marijuana. It's not about an incident of violence. It's about, the DOJ is a little incredulous that a police officer might smell marijuana from a car going 60 miles an hour. I smell marijuana from cars on I-40 on basically a weekly basis. I mean, right? If you're on I-40, going 70 miles an hour, let alone 80 miles an hour, there's going to be a car in front of you, and there's marijuana coming from that car. I'm not saying that person should be arrested, and I'm sure not saying that they should be abused in any way. But there is a kind of, it's just interesting when you get these third-party reports. There's sometimes some disconnect that doesn't add up and reconcile with daily life in Memphis and in other cities. We're not the only one with crime.
I think the dilemma is, and what the report talked about was, using traffic stops as
Absolutely.
a means,
100%,
as basically the tip of the spear
pretextual
for law enforcement.
Yes.
That, I think, is the distinction.
Yeah.
But you're right. Most of the mayor's race was about, do we pull people over for outrageous driving?
Yeah.
That was a major issue.
Well, and has been, in this set, there's 6 categories of remedies, 18 separate remedies that this report suggests. Most of them being to do things that are evidence-based and in response. But, to your point, one of those things is to cut down on traffic stops for these sorts of things. And we know how that has gone here. There was a question, I listened to the DOJ press conference on the way to this, where someone said, how should Memphis reconcile the fact that the federal DOJ is telling them to do something that its local government has tried to do and the state has said, you may not do that. And just goes into, I think, the continued question of, now that we have continued to identify this set of problems, what can we do about them?
Other last thoughts on this, and we'll talk about some other things.
Yeah, just last thought for me was in reading y'all's great reporting on this, reading some of the stuff myself. One of the major arguments out there against the consent decree, no government agency wants. They all want independence. They don't want another agency kind of looking over their shoulder. I get that, but maybe the second or third reason against it is that we can't afford it. And to me that was a little callous. I thought that was kind of coarse. How can we not afford to do this to make better policing when we're getting ready to pay out easily millions of dollars to the Tyree Nichols family here? It's a tough, awful situation, and I'm not saying the consent decree is the exact way to go, but to use that as a reason against it, thought it was strange.
Yeah.
I think you're going to hear a lot about better training. Better training, the more times you talk about that, and it doesn't happen, or it doesn't connect with the reality of what cops do, the less effective that becomes, the more frustrating it becomes.
We'll kind of segue on some other things here with, we got 7 minutes left here. Toby mentioned the Tyree Nichols civil case from the family against the city of Memphis. The city has talked about, that being some hundreds of millions of dollars, bankrupting the city. To add a little more, and recently came out with a filing that was rough, and the filing I think was then sealed, but Sam Hardiman on our staff got a hold of it, and the city making some claims about Tyre Nichols involving a possible domestic issue with his child's mother back, I think it was in California, and obviously it seems trying to get some leverage in this case. It's getting ugly. It's going to get uglier. I mean, the city, most people would say the city, county, the local government handled the Tyre Nichols case once it happened pretty well in terms of coming forward, not making excuses, but this civil case is going to get kind of ugly. But let's do a hard segue to other big news in the schools. And in Fraser and Cordova, the two big high schools have been talked about to be built. Talk about what's going on with that, Laura.
Sure. So we had a replacement school for Germantown High School, which is set to close in the next 7 years because of a state law that ceded those buildings back to Germantown. That's one thing that everybody can remember from a couple of years ago becoming really necessary. And as that happened, there was a new high school in Fraser that was also on the same timeline. Those really came to a head after the wheel tax was passed, and then these next cost estimates for the schools ballooned way above what the projected amounts were that these new dollars were supposed to be able to cover. And so there was this question that was supposed to be solved by a budget amendment this month from the county that would say, here's how we're going to pay for these. And the point was that there were going to be meetings between school officials and the county to bring down those cost estimates closer to what the county had said that they would be able to pay for. What happened is that budget amendment is coming, but it is instead accelerating the timeline for the Fraser High School that will replace Trezevant and Old Fraser High, and puts a big question mark on the Cordova project. And that was really that really was set into motion by the fact that the city council decided to vote down the zoning request from the school district, which was kind of the last check mark in this really years-long plan to build the Cordova School, and just said that the land was inappropriate both for traffic and environmental reasons.
Thoughts on the school construction? I mean, you've watched this many times over many years.
Well, there's going to be a proposal to increase the county funding for the Fraser High School that goes to the county commission in committee next week. Basically, it's moving money from other capital projects to this, including some of the money for Cordova.
Yeah.
Mayor Lee Harris is saying that the money will, the amount for Cordova will still be there.
And the county owns that land, right? They bought that land?
No.
They have an option on it.
So
or
they,
something.
it was basically it would only be purchased if the permit went through.
We'll go over to you, Toby, some of the things you've been covering. I mean, one thing that's big national news right now is yesterday, Wednesday, the U.S. Supreme Court was hearing a transgender ban case that came out of Tennessee. A majority of the justices appeared likely to uphold the state ban, was the general take by AP, Washington Post, New York Times, and so on. I know you had thoughts on that. I know you also have been covering some stuff at the state.
That's right. Really with the trans healthcare situation, it really has just put Tennessee at the top of the heap of states that are kind of fighting against some of this healthcare stuff, and advocacy groups are just saying, stay out of it. Stay. This should be between the healthcare provider and these families and their kids, and they know what's best for them. Which is an argument that the other side uses for almost everything. The government doesn't know best, families know best. So there's been kind of that similar tension going on there. We'll see how it plays out. Like you said,
I'll interrupt. Sorry to interrupt. No. 26 states at least have adopted laws restricting or banning transgender care for minors, and most of them face lawsuits. But again, with the new administration coming in, it seems likely that and given the nature of the Supreme Court, that not a lot of that's going to go.
That's right.
Go ahead.
And the other thing is, as far as state tax revenues, kind of boring, but the new projection that just came out of the budgeting process shows kind of single-digit 1 to 2% growth rate in the state budget there, and this comes after years of double-digit growth in these things. We've had kind of a flush bank account over there, and then state GOP, they gave a bunch of tax cuts, and they just gave money back to corporations. I think $900 million so far has gone back to 44 corporations or something like that in Tennessee, just as a rebate, not as a cut, so that money went straight back. And that comes at a time when all the other, during this budget process, we've seen all of these other agencies ask for more money for everything, and they may not get that money this year. And all that is on the back of about a backlog of Tennessee infrastructure projects of about $35 billion, I think.
I'll say with 30 seconds left. In a normal roundtable, we would also talk about XAI, Elon Musk's company, is poised to invest billions of dollars more in its Memphis supercomputer, and that some big key suppliers, companies like NVIDIA, Supermicro, Dell, could be building or investing in Memphis manufacturing facilities. We do a whole show on that. We may end up doing a show on some of those things, but we're out of time. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Bill. It's good to see you back here. The voice made it. It's rough, but getting there. We're getting back. So really appreciate you being here very much. But that is all the time we have this week. If you missed any of the show today, you can get the full episode at WKNO.org. You can get it as a podcast wherever you download your podcast, or you can go to YouTube, The Daily Memphian, or again, WKNO.org. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next week.